now that we've kind of hung out with the male system, we're going to hang out with female reproductive system. And just like with the male one, what we're going to focus on here is physiology, the ovarian events, uterine events, hormones, and oogenesis. Make sure that you spend some time with the images from the lab, that you go through the structures and you know the functions of all of them as well. But you've seen this before, and just because we're talking about females, it's no different. So same concept with the females. You have gonads, and you have accessory organs. The accessory organs are internal, external genitalia, they're glands, they're ducts, and things like that. Gonads in females are responsible for the same things. They are responsible for making the gametes and secreting hormones. All right, females. The big thing in females is to understand that you've got something going on in the ovaries. So we're going to look basically at oogenesis, the making of an oocyte. Well, in females, it's a similar concept. We start with a stem cell. It does a division to make more stem cells. Then that stem cell undergoes a change and becomes a primary oocyte. What's different in females is that happens before we're born. So by the time we're born, we already have primary oocytes. Now our oocytes are always surrounded by cells. So if you take an oocyte and you surround it with cells, you get a structure we're going to call a follicle. So if you did a slice through an ovary, you'd see follicles. Now, again, we're going to be born with our follicles. And then once we hit puberty, we're going to start to ripen up a few follicles so that we can release 1, maybe 2 eggs each month. We are going to look at the different types of follicles and how they go through this development process. When we start out, though, when we're first born or when we have follicles that haven't developed yet, those cells, that oocyte, is surrounded by one layer of cells. And they're kind of flat cells. And in that case, we call them follicle cells. But once hormones start to hit that individual follicle, those follicle cells kind of get fat, more like cuboidal cells, and they start to divide to make layers. At that point, we call them granulosa cells. So a follicle is an oocyte surrounded by cells, and they're either follicle cells or granulosa cells. And we're going to get this thing to develop by dumping hormones on it. So we did this in lecture. I started out by just circling follicles. And I said, do they look different? Everybody said, yeah. And then I said, if it looks different, and y'all replied, is different. So each of the follicles I just circled is a different follicle. It's a follicle going through a different stage of development. So these are the ones we're born with. Those are primordials. They would have one layer of follicle cells around them. Puberty came, magic happened, hormones started to hit that primordial follicle, and the cells started to divide. So what you're seeing here are layers of cells. And remember, once we have layers of them, we call them granulosa cells. So we're going to go through the developmental stages. I just wanted to start by showing you that these follicles do go through a series of developmental processes. Now, they are right at the surface here. They're on the cortex, or they're in the superficial part of the ovary. And the whole goal, remember, is to ripen an egg. So you can see this little egg, orangey egg, inside. Erase the ink there. And we don't visually see it changing very much. It actually doesn't change very much until the very end, until 12 to 24 hours before this process. That process is called ovulation. And you can tell that when ovulation occurs, the entire follicle doesn't leave. Only the oocyte with a few cells wrapped around it leaves. So the follicle at this point almost looks like a water balloon sitting inside the ovary, but right at the surface. And it pops open. When it pops open, the cell, the oocyte, with its little layer of cells around it, is released. So again, that's ovulation. When you rupture the follicle, the cell gets released. Now, if you're wondering, well, wouldn't that cause like a wound on the ovary? It actually does. There is a wound on the ovary. Obviously, it's very small, but the wound is definitely there. That's why this outer layer of the ovary is called the germinal epithelium. These cells divide. So once that rupture happens, these cells will divide and heal or repair that rupture. All right, this picture over here is a photomicrograph of a follicle in development. You can see the oocyte in there. You can see the cells that surround it. They're granulosa cells, but they form a structure called a corona radiata. And then we see the rest of the cells here. This follicle is pretty into its development, and so you can start to see that the oocyte's getting peeled away here from these granulosa cells. And as we start to peel the oocyte away from the granulosa cells, that space fills with fluid, and that's called an antrum. So this thing is getting ready, getting closer to being ripe enough to ovulate. All right, so we're going to look at the cycle. Remember, this is where females get complicated because we got multiple things going on here. What I just showed you are going to be the series of events occurring in the ovary. Well, at the same time, there's a whole other organ called the uterus that's going through a series of events called the uterine events. And at the same time, there's a whole bunch of hormones sitting on top of all of this controlling it. So ovarian events are all about follicles and oocytes, like I just showed you, and we're going to come back to that in detail. Uterine events is the menstrual cycle. And the hormones that control all of this are gonadotropic releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, old friends from our past, and then some new friends, estrogen and progesterone. The nice thing is that the brain ovarian axis is very similar to the brain testicular axis. We're still going to have GnRH from hypothalamus go through a portal system to the anterior pituitary, where it causes FSH and LH secretion. So that's exactly the same. The difference is what FSH and LH do. So FSH and LH don't come out at the same time, not like they do in males. And FSH and LH act on an ovary and stimulate different events. Okay? So let's shift our focus right now on the ovarian cycle and how we're going to make this oocyte. Remember, even before this, in our development, we had oogonium. And the oogonium underwent a few physical changes, and it got a layer of cells wrapped around it, and it became a primary oocyte. And that primary oocyte is diploid, just like the oogonium was diploid. So that's what we see here. That diploid oocyte is a primary oocyte. That one with the little circle means primary. So we're born with primary oocytes that have not gone through meiosis yet, wrapped in one layer of cells. And that one layer of cells around that primary oocyte is called the primordial follicle. So we're born with primordial follicles. Puberty happens, we're going to start to dump hormone on this. That's the hormone. And as we start to dump FSH on this thing, it starts to develop. And what we see is the follicle cells develop into granulosa cells, and we get layers of them. That's a primary follicle. The oocyte hasn't done anything yet. The primary follicle continues to develop, and the oocyte starts to get peeled away, and we see the beginning of that fluid-filled space. At that point, we have a secondary follicle. Notice the egg hasn't done anything yet. That continues to develop, and secondary follicles actually make tons and tons of estrogen. That's supposed to be an E. All right, more about estrogen later. So the secondary follicle continues to develop, and now it becomes huge. It's that giant water balloon, and it reaches a point where there's so much fluid and it's so big it can't contain it anymore. And there's actually a hormone event here. That's LH. That is going to stimulate this big, massive change. So the point at which you have a follicle that's gigantic and ready to rupture, that's called a Graafian follicle. And right after we get a Graafian follicle, we get a huge surge in estrogen, which causes a surge in LH. It's even called the LH surge. That gigantic spike in LH is going to trigger this event, final maturation and ovulation. And notice what my egg did. After the LH surge, that primary oocyte will enter and complete the first meiotic division. At that point, it's a secondary oocyte. So that's haploid. What we actually ovulate out is a secondary oocyte, or an oocyte that is haploid. So here's what we've been talking about. Remember, we're born with primordial follicles. One layer of follicle cells, a circular structure. The cells are relatively flat. It is a primary oocyte. Dump FSH on that, it begins to develop. Those flat cells become cuboidal and they divide and make layers. We call them granulosa cells. That's a primary oocyte. Dump some more follicle stimulating hormone on that. It begins to develop so much that it becomes a secondary follicle, and the oocyte's getting pulled away from the granulosa cells. That creates a fluid-filled space called an antrum, and the secondary oocyte starts making a lot of estrogen. A late primary starts to make the estrogen, but really where you get a lot is the secondary. Estrogen levels rise and rise and rise. That causes LH to rise and rise, and all of a sudden we get this LH surge. As those estrogen levels were rising, but before LH surge, this follicle got really huge. And at that point, we call it a Graafian follicle. The antrum is almost all the way around the oocyte. The oocyte has this thin layer of cells around it called a corona radiata. The Graafian follicle is secreting bucket loads of estrogen. So estrogen levels at this point are really high. And then all of a sudden, it switches from positive feedback to negative. Estrogen levels crash, and that helps us make an LH surge. So we get a huge push of LH secretion. That LH secretion stimulates the final ripening of the follicle. It ruptures, and we get an ejection of an oocyte. And the oocyte that gets ejected is a secondary oocyte because it just went through its first meiotic division. So the oocyte goes on its merry way, and its fate is now independent of the ovary. The granulosa cells left behind now undergo physical changes. They do a rapid division, and they become a mass instead of a hollow structure. That mass is called a corpus luteum. The function of the corpus luteum is to secrete progesterone and some estrogen for about 14 days. And what the estrogen and this massive amount of progesterone are going to do is prepare the uterus for pregnancy. If pregnancy doesn't occur after about 14 days, the corpus luteum dies, which means the progesterone and estrogen levels are going to drop. When they drop, there's nothing left to keep the endometrium in place, and then the period starts. So I've already been hinting at the hormones here. I've already been hinting at some of the uterine events as well. So these are the ovarian events, going from a primordial follicle to a corpus luteum. So I'm not gonna, but stop with the slide for a little bit. See if you can go through all of this and identify what oocyte you have and what kind of follicle you have in each of the places where I made a star, and see if you can figure out what this thing is and what it's doing. So hopefully you took my advice. All right, as we were talking about the follicles, I was mentioning what was going on with the cell. So remember, this slide kind of breaks it down for us. Before we are born, we had an oogonium that did mitosis to make more. That oogonium, even though it's diploid, it started to do a few physical changes. It got wrapped by a layer of follicle cells, and now it's a primordial follicle with a primary oocyte. And this thing went into prophase 1, the very, very, very first step of meiosis, but then it stopped. So it's frozen right at the beginning of meiosis. Then we go through childhood. Nothing happens. Then puberty happens. And we talked about the fact that we start with FSH. FSH stimulates growth of the follicle until we get a Graafian follicle. And all the while, we've been making estrogen. This big spike in estrogen causes an LH surge. And the LH surge triggers maturation. And what happens is that oocyte becomes active. So it finishes that first meiotic division, makes 2 cells, just like the spermatogonium did. What's different is that the division was not equal. One of the cells stayed really big, and that stays the active oocyte. That's now a secondary oocyte, and that's what we ovulate out. But the other quote-unquote cell stayed tiny, and it's just called a polar body. Now, should this ovulated egg get fertilized, it finishes the second meiotic division, and you still end up with a haploid gamete getting penetrated by a sperm, and then that little polar body may or may not do its division. But if we look at the pattern, we can see the pattern was exactly the same in males. You started with 1 diploid stem cell. You ended up with 4 haploid cells. In females, only 1 of those haploid cells becomes the gamete. In males, all 4 of the haploid cells become the gamete. So hopefully you took my advice and you sat and you hung out with the follicles for a little bit and tried to identify them. If we were to take all those follicles and divide them into phases of the ovarian cycle, we'd see that there's 3 phases. Now, this is based on a 28-day average. Most women do not have a 28-day cycle, so do not use counting numbers as a birth control method. It is a surefire way of getting pregnant. All right, the first couple of weeks is called the follicular phase because it's named after the fact that follicles are growing. You're increasing FSH, but the follicle itself is making more and more and more estrogen. So estrogen is increasing during this time, and estrogen at this point is kind of positive feedback. The more estrogen it makes, the more estrogen it makes. Then we have a spike in estrogen, and then it drops. That stimulates an LH surge, and that's on around day 14-ish on average of a 28-day cycle. Again, do not use that number as a birth control method. The surge of LH hormone triggers final maturation. So we talked about the fact that the follicle finishes ripening, and this primary oocyte becomes a secondary oocyte. The follicle then ruptures, and that secondary oocyte gets released, where hopefully it'll go up the fallopian tube and may or may not be fertilized. At that point, we did look at the fact that the granulosa cells stay behind. They divide and undergo a morphologic change to become a mass rather than a hollow ball. That mass is called the corpus luteum. And the function of the corpus luteum is to secrete progesterone and some estrogen. And those 2 hormones are going to help prepare the uterus for pregnancy. That part was called the luteal phase because it's named after the corpus luteum. The only thing I'm going to add here is this is what happens if you get pregnancy versus no pregnancy. Without pregnancy, between 10 to 14 days after ovulation, depends on the individual, the corpus luteum dies. When it dies, it forms a kind of whitish scarred tissue kind of structure called the corpus albicans that eventually breaks down. If pregnancy does occur, cholesterol, that's funny. The corpus luteum continues to secrete progesterone and several other hormones as well. It'll continue to make some estrogen. It also starts to make a hormone called HCG. You don't have to write it down. HCG is human chorionic gonadotropin. HCG is the hormone that the pregnancy test tests for. Now, if pregnancy occurred and the corpus luteum starts making these hormones that support and maintain the pregnancy, the corpus luteum will stay around until about the end of the first trimester, at which point a fully formed placenta takes over the function of maintaining the pregnancy. So interestingly enough, you can be 5 months pregnant. You can walk around the corner and someone sees your belly before they see you, that kind of thing. There's a baby moving around in there and everything. And if you took one of those pee on the dipstick pregnancy tests, it would test negative. Because again, it only tests HCG. Interesting tidbit to talk about late at night with people on the phone. All right, so hormones in females. The hormones sound familiar because we've been talking about them. Here we go. GnRH secreted from hypothalamus goes to anterior pituitary, causes secretion of FSH and LH. They not necessarily at the same time. Remember, FSH increases the follicle starts to make estrogen. That estrogen feeds back. Okay. In the follicular phase, estrogen levels rise and rise and rise. You start to get a little bit of inhibition. It's when estrogen levels hit really high levels that you get the LH surge. There's a little surge in FSH, but the big guy is an LH surge. The surges of those hormones, specifically LH, cause final maturation and ovulation. The follicle ends up becoming a corpus luteum. Corpus luteum produces a lot of progesterone, some estrogen, and even some inhibin, and that actually blocks GnRH. So during the follicular phase, we got the blue arrows, more and more and more hormone. During the luteal phase, we got the red dashed arrow. We actually have a hypothalamus that's shut off, and FSH and LH production that drop. They eventually go back up again. And so, in lecture I talked a little bit about this. I said, if you already got a bun in the oven, you're not going to make another ovulation. You're not going to try and send another bun out there. After class, someone asked me, why does the corpus luteum hang out for, a couple of weeks? Why is it there for so long? Well, even if this egg gets fertilized, it's not going to implant in the uterine wall, in the endometrium, until a good 10 to 12-ish days after it was fertilized. So it's going to take almost 2 weeks, about 10-ish days, for the embryo to implant. And the corpus luteum lives about 10-ish to 14 days. So it has to live that long to know whether you got pregnant or not. So again, I'm not going to, but you should stop the slide. You should go through these hormones. Look, I'll even clear all the ink off the slide. Go through these hormones, have an understanding of this hormonal cycle in females. And the fact that in females, it's cyclic. Alright, and here's what the hormones were doing. Remember, GnRH causes FSH, grows the follicle, estrogen rises. When estrogen peaks, everything switches, we get an LH surge. LH surge stimulates final maturation ovulation. We get a production of a corpus luteum, secretes a lot of progesterone and some estrogen. The progesterone prepares the endometrium for pregnancy. No pregnancy, it breaks down. Pregnancy, it stays active. And again, make sure you have a good understanding of these hormones and how they're working. And remember, in females, it's cyclic. All right, so now we've come to it. Finally, we're going to look at the uterine events. How does all these hormones, same hormones, thank God, but how do all these hormones affect the uterus specifically? Again, I've kind of been hinting at it. Well, we can divide the menstrual cycle up into 3 sets of days, which is what we're going to do. We're going to divide it into 3 phases. And what we're talking about with the uterus primarily is changes in the endometrium and even changes in the stratum functionalis. Now, the 3 phases of the menstrual cycle are divided into menstrual phase, proliferative phase, or secretory phase. The menstrual phase is days 1 through day 15, and that's the menstrual flow. That's the proverbial period. So that's when the endometrium from the previous month's cycle that wasn't needed is shed and comes out. So day 1 of the period is day 1 of the cycle. So the menstrual phase is going to last however long bleeding lasts for that individual woman on that individual month. It's very variable. All right, then for the next week or so, we're starting to get the increasing estrogen from our developing follicle. Well, that increasing estrogen from that developing follicle has found its way to the uterus, and it stimulates the endometrium. So we start to get building of the stratum functionalis. It increases in its thickness, and it increases the amount of blood vessels that are there. So blood vessels have to actually grow into this tissue that's growing. Then we have ovulation, and then after ovulation, remember, we got a lot of progesterone and then some estrogen. That lots of progesterone and then some estrogen finds its way to the endometrium, where it enters the secretory phase. It grows somewhat as well, but it prepares for implantation of the embryo. One of the reasons that's called the secretory phase is the endometrium starts secreting things like glycogen. Glycogen is chains of glucose. It's a storage form of glucose, which is a food molecule, a nutrient molecule. So the endometrium is getting ready for implantation of an embryo by making sure there's a carbohydrate source for the embryo to use. And so what happens with, the whole hormone thing? Well, if pregnancy does not occur, remember, the corpus luteum dies. When the corpus luteum dies, the progesterone and some of that estrogen, but that progesterone and estrogen levels fall, and they fall fast. I'll show you a graph in a little bit. When progesterone levels fall, the endometrium falls off. There's nothing to hold it in place anymore. And here's what happens. The spiral arteries, in lecture I pointed at them. The spiral arteries come out of the stratum basalis, and then from there you grow them into the stratum functionalis. The spiral arteries spasm and kink on themselves. So they kind of turn and cut themselves off. So the rest of the blood vessel that left the spiral artery and was growing through the stratum functionalis dies. Well, when that blood vessel dies, there's no blood going in there, and the cells of that part of the endometrium die. The functional layer then just starts to digest itself. Not in that there's a bunch of cells alive that are eating it, but it just chemically starts to fall apart. There's no living cells to maintain it anymore, and that's what causes it to slough off and fall out, and that would be day 1 of the next menstrual cycle. So I kept saying I'd show you some graphs. So here we go. Don't worry about the unit. Just understand this is the amount of the hormone on the side, and then we have time. Okay, this would be day 1 of the menstrual cycle. And we can follow LH and FSH here, coming from the pituitary. And notice how they kind of go up. See, look at LH is kind of goes up a little bit, and then it's really stable. Notice how FSH kind of rises. It becomes stable because you're just feeding the follicle, and then it kind of goes down. Well, right about here was where we had peak estrogen. Our estrogen levels spiked from our follicle. And that spike in estrogen does cause an FH spike, but the spike we cared most about was that LH surge. So you can see that LH surge is huge and dramatic. LH hasn't been around. It has this rapid increase, a rapid decrease, and then disappears again. Well, ovulation is going to take place about 12 to 24 hours after that LH surge. Okay? Now, that was LH and FSH. We can see estrogen. This estrogen started a little high only because there was a little leftover estrogen from the previous month cycle. But it drops within a couple of days. We have low levels of estrogen, and then, oh look, I got a follicle, a secondary follicle starting to make it. Positive feedback, Graafian follicle, tons and tons. Switches to negative feedback, triggers LH surge, levels drop. Now I have a corpus luteum. Corpus luteum begins to secrete some. Pregnancy didn't occur, corpus luteum dies, estrogen fell. It's kind of fun if it weren't so crazy. Alright, we can look at progesterone. Progesterone, definitely, it's produced by corpus luteum, so none of it until you start to get a corpus luteum. Obviously, my overlap is off, but until a corpus luteum forms, and then you get it. Pregnancy didn't occur, crashes to 0. That would be day 1 of the next menstrual cycle. And we wonder why girls get a little interesting sometimes. All right, we could superimpose ovarian cycle over uterine cycle so you can see I'm going to draw the line at ovulation because that's when the hormone stories change, right? You can see that as we stimulate and we get this follicle, remember after the secondary follicle, we start to get a bunch of estrogen. So you can see estrogen's effect on the endometrium. After ovulation, we get some estrogen, but we also get progesterone. So you can see progesterone and estrogen's effect on the endometrium. See all the additional blood vessels, and realize it's actually secreting nutrient molecules now too. When the corpus luteum dies, you can see the levels of hormones would drop off, and you can see the effect of new progesterone or estrogen. And then right about there, day 1 of the next menstrual cycle. So pause the slide. I think we're pretty much done. Go through, understand all the hormones, the roles of each hormone, how they change. Understand ovarian cycle, the roles of the hormones in the ovarian cycle, how the follicle and the oocyte change. Understand the uterine cycle. Understand the changes in the endometrium and how those are caused by changes in the hormones. All right, so some of the other things about estrogen and progesterone. We already saw their effect on follicles, and we see their effect on the endometrium. But here's some other things. When estrogen levels rise during puberty, again, that's going to trigger oogenesis and follicle growth. But rising estrogen during puberty also increases growth of our uterine tubes or our fallopian tubes, our uterus, even the vagina. So our reproductive structures actually get bigger with estrogen and progesterone secretion, primarily estrogen. The hormone also increases motility. So, not that a uterus is going to get up and run away, right? But by motility here, we mean peristaltic waves. So the ability to do peristaltic waves to draw sperm in, peristaltic and cilia waves to kind of move the egg through the fallopian tube into the uterus, and then even to do motility of contraction of the uterus to thin out the cervix and push the baby out. All of that functionality comes about because of the growth of the smooth muscle by estrogen. One of the things I mentioned to somebody in lab who asked me is once the uterus has been pregnant and given birth once, those smooth muscle cells that you increased, you got more of, stay. And those cells have estrogen receptors on them. So the second pregnancy and the second birth tends to be faster because the uterus already knows what to do. It's primed to receive the hormones. The third, even faster. And, have enough kids and you're pretty much having them at home. Just kind of, just on the living room floor. I've actually had people I know that happened to. Also, the thickness and activity of the mucosa is affected by estrogen as well. So, another interesting tidbit. During that menstrual phase and during all this cyclic events, I mentioned earlier that mucus secretion from the cervix changes. So, before ovulation, after ovulation, it tends to be somewhat thick, and that's a protective mechanism for the endometrium. But right at ovulation, that LH surge, one of the things it triggers is the cervix changes its position and it becomes more lined up with the vagina, so easier passageway for sperm. And the mucus that comes off the cervix thins out. So it's almost like a raw egg white texture. And that's to allow more sperm past it. Okay, so even mucus and lubricating secretions change throughout the cycle depending on estrogen and progesterone. All right, so we looked at some of the other things with testosterone. We're going to look at the other things with estrogen. We talked about the fact that it causes the myometrium to grow. It also causes the breast to grow. It makes the pelvic bones get lighter. Remember, our female skeleton isn't as heavy or dense as the male skeleton. The problem, unfortunately, with that comes later with osteoporosis. That's why we get it, and guys get it with less frequency. But it also changes the angle of some of our bones. So our pelvic bones are at a slight angle to each other, which gives us hips, but it also makes the passageway, that is the birth canal, bigger. It causes growth of axillary and pubic hair, obviously, and estrogen also increases subcutaneous fat, especially in the hips and in the breasts. In lecture I mentioned we store estrogen in our fat, And so we talked about issues with obesity versus like marathon runners and being amenorrheic or having fertility issues. But that's because we're in the modern era. Our ancient ancestors didn't eat very often, so it was advantageous to store a little bit of body fat and some estrogen. I like to say that I was born in the wrong era as far as art is concerned. I should have been born during the Middle Ages when the era of art was Rubenesque. There was an artist, Rubens, and he would paint fat women. So I should have been born in the Rubenesque era. All right, so I do believe we're done. So hopefully this helped you understand some of the physiology of the female. And again, we did oogenesis, same processes of males with a slightly different twist. We looked at the hormones, almost the same hormones as males. The twist just comes at the end, in that it's estrogen and progesterone. And then we looked at the cycles in females, ovarian cycles, which is divided into follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. And then we looked at menstrual cycle, which is divided into menstruation, proliferative phase, secretory phase. I hope that helps.